Hello and welcome to the Green Room at Furnitubes. I'm your host, Catherine Barrett, and we're here every month with a new episode. Join us for industry musings, interviews and discussions exploring all things landscape architecture, street furniture and urban design. Hello and welcome to the Green Room and the first podcast in our series on sustainability in landscape architecture. Today, I'm joined by Alistair Bayford, Business Development Director at Maylim, and he's here to discuss sustainability and the decarbonising of construction and its supply chain. This podcast is actually in two parts. Today, we will have the first part looking at the state of the industry and how landscape architects can really make a difference, the impact on supply chain, and what Maylim are doing to support decarbonising of construction. Alistair, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Catherine. Pleased to be talking about something that's very poignant at the minute, certainly arising from COP26, but it is the focus of everyone involved in construction at the moment to look at sustainable options for building out schemes and full life cycle carbon strategies for the industry.
Can you paint a picture for me then of a landscape construction site 25 years ago and how it's improved or regressed since then?
From what I've observed, when you draw back to early days in my career, there were always stretching targets for improving environmental performance.
Mm-hmm.
You had the launching of big sustainability drivers in construction. BREEAM. Construction was always striving to be more sustainable. What we'd see today compared to then is clearly stretching targets. I would say it's become more visible to those looking in at construction. But I would say there are many success stories that we don't reflect on.
Right.
So when you look at Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, 10 years ago, that was at the time pioneer for sustainable construction. And even today, we're well ahead of any targets we've set for reuse of construction materials coming out of the industry. So I don't think really much has changed in what construction was trying to do or is doing. I just think that there's greater levels of visibility and environmental performance is becoming certainly more important for clients and the general public or the population. So we're perhaps tasked now with sharing data sharing and learning from those opportunities that exist. And now I think we've exhausted all of the easy wins.
Yeah.
And now actually it's focused on the detail and how we try and achieve a supply chain that has low embodied carbon throughout all of its processes.
And then how do you then respond to data that the construction industry as a whole, not just landscape construction, contributes to so much of our emissions and to so much of the pollution in the UK?
It was only brought up in a discussion I had last week with an architect whereby buildings are much more advanced in their data sets for the supply chain and manufacturing processes. When it comes to landscape, I believe we've got a great deal of catching up to have those data sets to start making big waves and almost driving positive change to ensure that specifiers are specifying with knowledge so that they understand that selecting a certain material will have this much embodied carbon, selecting a certain supplier in a certain location in the UK would have more negative environmental impacts than a local supplier close to the project. So when it comes to data collection, I think the onus is on, I would say, an end user. So an end user being a contractor like Maylim, recording carbon associated with the process, and then sharing that back to industry, because that's the only way as a group that's tasked with building landscapes and construction being more sustainable, we can only do that with data.
Showing
and good
what you're actually
data.
using. So you're saying in the built environment, so in commercial construction, that data is more readily available and tracked.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And even records of, 222 million tonnes of waste generated in the UK. Broadly speaking, 60% of that is within the construction industry. How you would then proportionate that between what Maylim as a business control of, because it would be the lesser of the share of waste arising from construction activity. But when you delve into those numbers, a lot of focus is on the things you see. So single-use plastics, timber, and the rest of it. But nearly 66% of that construction waste is soil and minerals.
So the stuff we're taking away.
The stuff we're taking away to start the next scheme. Yeah. So that can be everything in the construction build-up. So existing paving, sub-base that's being lifted and removed. And then the soil, so where we're modifying topography or we're removing an existing topsoil, for example, and replacing it with imported. Now, we talk about waste, but then we don't talk about the positives. So of the waste that is generated by the construction industry, we're achieving between 80 and 85% recovered. So that's materials that are going back into the construction industry as another type of material. So where we take a mineral from a site, so existing paving, it will go to a tip, be crushed and come back as recycled type 1. But where we could make a difference is stopping that process. Because, of course, when you lift something and take it away, you generate carbon from the fossil fuels. And then when you bring it back, you have that process. Plus, you have all of the carbon generated as part of what we consider to be the construction processes of excavating something and then placing something back.
So 85% is reused, but there are still processes being used on that reuse. So better to minimise those processes.
Yes. So if you remove the process, you remove the carbon generated by it. But I guess what we focus on is a metric that says we are disposing this much waste. We don't then proportionate that. So the biggest impact could be reducing the amount of materials we remove from a site. But as I said, differentiating between landscape and buildings. So when you're taking out for a basement or you're boring a tunnel for a railway line, there is an associated amount of that that's, I guess, can't necessarily be minimised because you're not drilling the tunnel or you're not building the basement of a building. But equally, when it comes to landscape, historically over the years seen so much material being removed from site that's suitable for reuse or with a soil amelioration, but instead there's this kind of drive to take something away and bring something new into the scheme.
I mean, it's the way we think. We're thinking more and more generally about shouldn't be new every time. What else can you do with repurposed, reused materials generally, not just in construction?
Absolutely. And almost repurposing a material, whether that's in the scheme or whether that's future scheme. I've often challenged this concept of, I've seen in my career schemes that I worked on 20 years ago. I'm now going back in and lifting them and relaying them. Now, some of those schemes had a design life of 50 years with some of the products. So when you look at concrete or you look at granite and natural materials, you're then saying, well, actually, we've cut the life of that scheme short by 30 years. So if there's this repetitive cycle of rejuvenating a park or a piece of public realm every 20 years, then we're kind of losing a bit of a battle with generating carbon because that scheme is either not future-proofed or it's been, dare I say it, designed without consideration for the future. Or it hasn't been maintained. One of the three.
When we're looking at new schemes with a 50-year life expectancy or design life expectancy, all of those factors need to be considered as well. Like, it's not just say 50 years and in 20 years we feel like something new or it hasn't been maintained properly, so we have to renew it. Actually have a maintenance package and a view to what it should look like in 50 years' time.
Absolutely. But equally, I think being fair to the way in which we're approaching projects now, there is a huge amount of retrofit, SUDs and urban greening. So
which is
by
important.
virtue, absolutely. So that there is this generation of waste arising from a need to get good, and it's kind of offsetting or compensating the two. But then the other factor I see more and more, having had that experience managing landscapes after, is I don't think we're really thinking about management and maintenance and the planned, the preventative and the reactive maintenance that would arise from decisions made during the design process. So all too often I see timber structures with a softwood superstructure and a hardwood finish. Now that superstructure is going to decay quicker than the bit you see. And some decisions to perhaps spend more in the capital phase of the project would have greater levels of performance, less environmental impact during the management and maintenance. And then you're, of course, extending the life of the materials or the project or the scheme and how it performs in 5, 10, 15 years.
So if this is where we are now in terms of what we're observing, looking at the greening that we're looking to do, we're more aware and conscientious of how we remove materials from sites and from schemes. What do you think the direction of travel then for the construction industry is, and what's the biggest challenge improving the way we look at improving emissions?
So I'm going to split this into two, and then hopefully it joins back together. So if we said our market, commercial sector and the local authority sector, they're very different at the moment. You've got the drive from big tier one main contractors driven by their clients. So if you take Grosvenor Estates, targeting 500 kilos per square metre of development, that's a significant target to strive to achieve. Now, the developer, the constructor will be tasked with achieving that statistic. Then that's being cascaded down the supply chain, down the tiers, so that ultimately we foresee that we'll be the ones holding that responsibility and looking outwards to our supply chain to assist us with achieving that target. I think there's greater levels of control there to be able to have an impact on your Scope 3 emissions. But then if we flip it over to the local authority, we have this split between price and quality. We know that quality scores, the evaluation criteria for quality has improved over the years. So often we see 40% for quality, 50% for quality. More too often and frequently we see 30% for quality. And my feeling still is that whilst you'll set aspirationally a requirement for achieving positive social outcomes, positive environmental outcomes, it costs money to do that. And therefore your price often is out of a target price for,
budget doesn't meet the requirements or the goals. There's a disconnect.
There absolutely is. So in simple terms, and we've done this exercise recently, specification will say European oak.
Right.
The cost of importing European oak to the country is cheaper than using a repurposed timber that is in the UK already.
Yep.
But the carbon emissions associated with the journey from, say, Eastern Germany compared with in the UK can be 17 times more carbon emissions generated from that journey alone. Yep. So the controls almost at specifying stage. So a decision to use a supplier or a product over another, and then you're asking your contractor to then make decisions to decarbonise the supply chain. And actually we have no control over the decisions that are made during the design process.
During the specification process.
And then when you look at, say, a simple thing like local spend, if you're delivering a project in London and not one of the suppliers that are nominated are based in London, you're immediately on a negative when it comes to carbon generated from, be it transport. Yes, we hope we're seeing that all manufacturers are driving improvements to their own Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, but we still feel less in control of those Scope 3s because we're in the hands of a supply chain that's under similar challenges than we are.
Right, and so not just having a quality and a cost component, but there's almost alongside cost, there's an emissions component. So you might want lower costs, but you've got to also be able to achieve the right emissions target as well.
So putting a number, and it's significant. If you took a European oak for a project, and I'll compare apples with apples, £18,000 to purchase and bring in compared with 21. So for £3,000 more,
what is the carbon?
You've got better or more positive environmental outcomes from spending a little bit more. And there's not necessarily that metric in a competitive open environment where price proportionately is the larger of the two.
Right.
And you're not necessarily getting scored highly for environment and social value. It's still, relatively speaking, 5% of the quality score compared with program and methodology.
Right.
Now, I know, and from experience, reducing carbon costs time. So time to plan, time to do things sensitively. But if you're tasked with mobilising to start very quickly, complete the job in a reduced period of time, and that takes the biggest score, then of course we're not going to be able to put forward an environmentally conscious solution, because I suppose the environment in which we're trying to achieve that is constrained by some key drivers to project completion, project budget, and perhaps going back to the earlier questions, the data set's not being there to know how much that might cost or
how much it moves the needle or how much it would cost. So an example we talked about earlier was with paving. Often it's to start a scheme or to green an area of an urban environment, we're removing paving and some of the soil underneath. And so to do that so that the paving can be reused without having to be processed, that takes more time. You have to do it more carefully than just smashing it up and removing it.
Absolutely.
So if you've got to get a scheme done in, say, 12 weeks or however many weeks or months it is, you're going to smash it rather than carefully remove it that could take 4 or 5 times as long.
Definitely. And using an example, we salvaged for reuse 300 tonnes of granite from our Exchange Square project. But that took time to sensitively deconstruct that landscape. And of course, some of the schemes that we're working on today have similar amounts of waste being arisen from removing existing natural stone. But when that natural stone is quite bespoke, you then look at what could you realistically yield from, a curved granite curb. So aspirationally, I would love to see products arising from our work being reclaimed.
Yes.
The time allowed to do that. And then once it is reclaimed, the capacity to store it, the capacity to then market it, to then get it coming back into
a library of reclaimed
schemes.
Materials for landscape architects to filter through, or for suppliers like Furnitubes to have access to.
Yeah, and we've kind of discussed how do you get timber?
Yeah, well, Ashwell timber is a great example of that. How do you get reclaimed timber back into the supply chain?
Going back, it costs money. Yeah. So it costs to salvage that material. It costs to repurpose that material. Yep. And often it's more expensive. Perhaps that's something to do with supply demand and
there's a limited supply. Yeah.
But equally, I think there is this consciousness that says we might have to spend more, but the environmental outcomes are more positive, and importantly, we're working towards the objectives of reducing our embodied carbon associated with a project, and importantly, the waste.
Ultimately, it's the client prioritising that, and landscape architects also making sure that agenda is pushed so that it's recognised by the
I've said
client.
it numerous times. Landscape architects as specifiers have always had it in their gift to make positive outcomes. When they're advising a client on a good and a bad choice.
They've got the ears of the client.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you can almost have this matrix presented that says, we could specify this product and this is the environmental impact. Forget cost.
Yeah.
If you're comparing a more cost-effective solution, say, compared to a more expensive, I think you need to break that down to say, why is that bench, for example, more expensive? Because this is the manufacturing process and this product has lower embodied carbon over its design life. So when you're manufacturing something and you've got your warranty, you're saying that bench will last for 20 years. We'd like to see it in that landscape for 20 years, but often it's not. And that kind of decision needs to be questioned as well. But if we've had it in our gift ever since I've been a landscape architect, then we need to change as advisors, advising clients on decisions that are made. And we need to look at schemes through different eyes almost and look at what we're yielding from a site. Can anything go back in to that scheme and be incorporated? How much time are we going to give a contractor to plan their work and look at the scheme to try and improve buildability, and almost would love to see environmental and social outcomes elevated in our evaluation process and a contractor scored highly for making the right decisions when it comes to investing locally and, importantly, minimising environmental impacts arising from the operations.
We've talked a bit about what clients can do, and it may also be helping clients understand what their options are, I guess. And we've talked about, showing a matrix of different opportunities or different possibilities in terms of what can be chosen. Does that sit with the architects and the landscape architects or the contractors, or is it a combination?
Almost shared responsibility, but I should have added this to the, what's changed in the last 20 years. Right. Of course, ultimately impacts my journey in my career, but we've transferred risk.
Right.
We've transferred risk from the client and the consultant team to the contractor to make a number of decisions. So there's collective responsibility there. And I would see that as knowledge share so that informed decisions can be made. We're experts in building things. So we're experts in understanding the interfaces and components and where you might be able to take an 8 mil thick edge down to 6 mil or even less in terms of having a positive impact on reducing the materials.
Yep.
But equally, if you took demolishing an existing landscape, carrying out a reduced dig excavation to 200 mil depth to bring in 150 mil of type 1, do you really need to take the existing type 1 away? But there'll be a risk associated with that. So the engineer designing the scheme will want to see a certain CBR rating on that subgrade and subbase. If that's then transferred over to the contractor, then we're tasked with ensuring that there is sufficient CBR rating in that subbase before laying that wearing course. So if risk transfer is all down to the contractor, then there's not that shared responsibility for providing a more efficient and sustainable outcome for the scheme. And I kind of almost see that in buildings as well. You know, we talk about repurposing or reusing or retrofitting a building rather than demolishing it and starting again. But who's taking the risk for that building being sufficiently engineered to support any modifications, additional floors going on top of it, the building being cut and carved to minimise the demolition activity? And that's the unanswered question that will play out over the next few years as we see more of it.
Do you think it could shift?
I think BIM will drive that because, of course, with BIM, you've got the modelling of that building to understand how it's been built, where strategic beams might be located. But, of course, that's now. So we'd like to think that we're not retrofitting or modifying a building that's being constructed today or in the last 5 to 10 years. But, of course, where we're looking at historic buildings, there is often this trade-off between what is more efficient, is demolishing the building to get better performance out of a future building the right decision, as opposed to trying to retrofit and having all the associated problems with doing so.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. We've talked a little bit, actually, quite a lot about what the landscape architects and specifiers can do to help decarbonise the supply chain. Are there any specific examples or case studies that you can think of where it's been approached from that perspective, where the consultants have taken a view on looking at the supply chain, basically, and how to minimise the carbon coming into a scheme?
A great example historically was working on the London Blossom project with Davis White and Edible Bus Stop. And looking at a different way of delivering a project using very local artisans, reclaimed materials. We talked about ash wells, but all of the timber elements were from reclaimed fenders and timbers from fluvial and tidal environments. And for me, that was a project that highlighted a design team bringing a contractor in early to talk about positives and negatives of certain materials. So it's working together from an early stage rather than being brought in once the scheme's decided. Decisions made and metrics brought in about a decision over a surface. So you immediately say the 100 linear metre path is going to be built out of concrete. Perception from a client is, well, hold on a minute, that's surely the worst decision we can make. Okay, so what are the solutions or the alternatives? We could use a self-binding gravel. Okay, so I'm going to take that decision, 2 products, let's extrapolate it over its perceived design life. So if we took 20 years, concrete will go on beyond a 20-year life. However, it gives the client a good understanding of over the next 20 years of management, what are the inputs? So with a self-binding gravel, it needs topping up. It needs maintenance, more regular maintenance than the concrete surface. And if you map that over the 20-year period, we found that in 10 years, you had lower embodied carbon in the concrete than you did in the self-binding gravel over its life. So we're taking not just the construction activity, but we're taking the management and the life of the products and I suppose the putting together of those components to make informed decisions about what we do. And then you take it one step further and you say, well, we're going to use a recycled aggregate. We're going to reduce the amount of cement utilised in the concrete. We're going to use a recycled subbase. So all the more, it's starting to minimise carbon and have positive environmental
And was that
impact.
a specific stated goal of the project, to look at every way that carbon could be minimised?
Yes,
carbon emissions
absolutely.
could be minimised.
Yeah.
So that it
had to be as sustainable a construction as possible.
And that was a target rather than price or some of the other.
It was that collaborative design process that brought the experts, the subject experts around the table to say, we're tasked with conceptually designing a scheme.
Yeah.
You're tasked with building it. Let's merge the two and come up with a solution that, practically speaking, can be delivered very efficiently on the ground to minimise the time there, but equally have less impact on the environment. And I would kind of always say, as a contractor, we have greater levels of control over our scope 1 and 2. And of a project, two elements that we are in control of are where we buy aggregates and where we buy soils. And that is primarily driven by locality, time and availability. So we would inadvertently be procuring those products from within London or the immediate outskirts, compared with, furniture that might be manufactured somewhere else in the UK.
Yeah.
And London Blossom Project was looking at a steel fabricator less than a mile away, a precast concrete manufacturer less than a mile away, and timber coming in that was from a repurposed supplier. And then our process is looking at how we build a concrete path utilising a batching plant within 200 yards of the site, utilising materials that are recycled. So on a very small scale, done right, it can be done. But plenty of examples that, in a Maylim world, that we're looking at every construction process to try and find solutions for clients, because if there's an efficiency there's an efficiency for Maylim as well as the client and the environment ultimately.
Join us for part 2, when we'll be discussing materials and the supply chain and how they can impact creativity and design in our industry. Alistair also answers our quick fire questions.